This image that I start with is an image of the emergency manager of Detroit and the governor of the state of Michigan. Detroit has famously gone through a period of bankruptcy in the last couple of years. It recently emerged from that period. And what I want to do today is to talk about Detroit as a way to understand the financial transformation of cities in the United States. And what I'll be suggesting is that the period that was ushered in by the bankruptcy of New York City in 1975, the period that we sometimes call entrepreneurial urbanism or neoliberal urbanism, that period, which is now 40 years in the making, is giving way to a period of deeply financialized urban governance and urban change. So I want to talk about the financial intensification, really, of the way in which cities are managed and the way in which their cities are restructured, and use Detroit's bankruptcy as a way to understand that process. So what I'll be covering today are 4 topics. Firstly, I'll say something in terms of the theoretical framing of the work about the nature of neoliberalism as a ideological program and its effects, particularly on cities, and how we understand neoliberalism theoretically. Then I'll move on to talk about how a system of what I've been calling austerity urbanism has been transforming the financial conditions of existence for American cities, for European cities, and I think for an increasing number of cities around the world. Then I'll move on to say something about what I call an ordinary crisis of the city of Detroit. Detroit's crisis receives a great deal of media commentary in the United States. There's a considerable degree of scapegoating of Detroit's past political leadership, its residents, as if they were effectively brought on their own crisis. I want to instead suggest that we need to understand the Detroit crisis in systemic terms, as an ordinary crisis of a system of financialized urban management, itself entering a period of restructuring crisis. And then I'll end by suggesting that maybe we need to start to think in new ways about urban politics in a kind of macro sense, that our ideas about urban growth machines and so on might need to be rethought in some places, especially like Detroit, where the dynamics of debt machines and persistent financial turmoil increasingly dominate urban politics. So let me first of all start with some theoretical comments on the nature of the neoliberal moment of transformations. Now, neoliberalism, as is well known in this audience, I'm sure, has a long and checkered history. As a theoretical concept also, it's somewhat controversial. Many of us have used this framing for understanding urban transformations in recent decades. But the concept of neoliberalism itself is often taken to refer to particular systems, particular politicians, eras, or whatever. And rather than that, rather static version of neoliberalism, I want to suggest that it's more appropriate to think of neoliberalization as a rolling, transformative process. So the way in which neoliberalization works is to operate as a paradigm of restructuring. It was forged, of course, in opposition to social statism in a variety of settings, not least of which Chile itself, given the work of the Chicago boys here, but it was formed in a multipolar universe in the 1970s and 80s, and as a really ideological program against various forms of social statism, including the developmental state, the socialist state, and welfare state. But it was born in the mid-20th century as, to borrow Hayek's term, a flexible credo, an adaptive model of governance designed to be not static and fixed, but in fact a rolling experimental program of transformation. So this means then that neoliberalism or neoliberalization as a set of processes is not trending towards a uniform future of 100% neoliberalization. It actually is an unevenly developed mode of governance in its very nature. And so it produces new forms of uneven geographical development. It constantly launches transformative programs in cities and at other scales. And this is an experimental process that results in endemic failure and also endemic rethinking of government strategies. So rather than a fixed set of procedures then, I understand neoliberalism as this rolling process of recalibrated, market-oriented governance. And to borrow Karl Polanyi's famous phrase, what neoliberalization envisages is a stark utopia of a free market future. But that's a utopia, of course, is an unattainable destination. So while those visions of a free market future inspire programs of restructuring, neoliberal restructuring, we will never ultimately live in a fully neoliberalized world. This is a utopian vision that Hayek, Friedman and others articulated starting in the middle of the 20th century. So this means that neoliberal politics are directional, not destinational. They don't imply we're going to arrive at a fully neoliberalized future, but they are about pressing in the direction of liberalization, marketization, commodification, privatization, as a contradictory path of development, producing many recoils, failures, mid-course adjustments, and so on. So this, to me, is how neoliberalization works, as this contradictory path towards an unattainable future. Neoliberalism, then, as a project, is incomplete and it's incompletable. It will always exist in a frustrated, some might say angry form. This is reflected in the attitude of neoliberal reformers, who are always impatient, always see obstacles in the way, are constantly working on their removal, never think the job is done. I've spent quite a few years talking to the organic intellectuals of the neoliberal movement in Washington, think tanks and so on. Very few of whom will accept that any progress has been made in the direction of free markets during their lifetimes. They see only a series of challenges and obstacles in the way. Their work is never done. And so this kind of frustrated, slightly angry attitude is, I think, the nature of the neoliberal reformer. So they, in a sense, perhaps also realise that they will never get to their destination of pure freedoms, perfectly functioning markets, and so on. This also means that neoliberalisation, and the process of neoliberalisation, can only be found in a series of unhappy marriages with other systems. Neoliberalism can't live on its own. It is a parasitical project in many ways. It grafts itself onto other social formations which it seeks to transform, but cannot transform them in a total way. And so that means that neoliberalism has to cohabit with other social and governmental phenomena in a contradictory, unhappy relationship. So there are always other things going on in society than neoliberalisation. It's never a total process, even if it is, as I would argue, currently hegemonic. So what neoliberalism does, or neoliberalisation as a process then, is to define an ideologically acceptable solution space. It frames the set of politically acceptable solutions to immediate problems. And the kinds of narrow set of policy options that were considered after the Wall Street crash of 2008 is a good illustration of the relatively narrowly framed set of options that neoliberalism presents. So it's in this context that I think we can understand the rise of austerity in Europe, and I also would say in the United States, as a particular moment in this rolling history of neoliberalisation. Now, what austerity means, austerity is a political project, is the redistribution downwards of the costs of economic adjustment, where the burdens are placed on those at the bottom of the social structure and on local actors in particular. It describes a way in the United States that the process by which what began as a banking crisis in 2008 has been progressively transformed into a state crisis. If you were to watch Fox News on American TV, you would have the impression that the 2008 crash was caused by the pensions of school teachers in Wisconsin. I can tell you that empirically this was not the case, but ideologically this is now the representation of the crisis, that it was caused by a bloated state. And the solution, therefore, is the purging, the financial purging of the state as a way to restore competitiveness and so on. So this narration of the way in which the crisis has been re-narrated, essentially, is about telling a story of moving towards small state solutions yet again. And that this story has been told particularly as Tom Slater's talk illustrated on the first day by conservative think tanks and their allies in the media, who narrate a story of large state crises, social state crises, in order to justify new attacks on a series of urban actors in particular. So these new narrations of social state crisis in the United States tend to focus on these old adversaries of neoliberalism, the public sector unions, the pension schemes that are a legacy of previous waves of municipal development, and new waves of privatisation that are being authorised. What this foretells is a series of lean local government and small state crises. So again, this is a form of neoliberalisation, I would argue, that is pushing not towards a stable solution, but instead to a further series of contradictions and problems which will then have to be managed in yet more imaginative ways. What austerity urbanism in the United States means institutionally is that budgetary constraint is established as an operating matrix for cities and for state governments as well. This is increasingly the fiscal framing within which urban policy and urban politics is undertaken. And I won't dwell on this too much because this gets more into the details of American governmental financing than this audience needs to know about. But I'll just summarise it by saying that the prevailing orthodoxy is one known as fiscal federalism, that suggests that each unit of government should be able to exist independently of others. So you live within your means at the local level or at the state level. It's a doctrine that comes from the Chicago School of Law and Economics that suggests that there should be no fiscal transfers between levels of government or between across governmental institutions. So it's a recipe for devolved self-sufficiency of local and state government units. And this means, in effect, that financial discipline in the American system trickles down from the federal to the state to the local level, in particular to discipline the big cities, which are the largest spenders in the municipal government system. It indicates a shift away from an essentially Keynesian model of redistributive transfers, which were anti-cyclical in logic, to a debt-based financing system based on recurrent austerity purging. Increasingly, government spending becomes pro-cyclical rather than anti-cyclical. And a new landscape is being produced in the wake of these financial logics, a landscape divided between bankrupt cities in California and Michigan and elsewhere, and fiscally gated suburbs, each of which is in a sense living within their locally determined means. So what does austerity, urbanism, or devolved austerity mean in the United States more concretely? The first thing to say about this is the context to the fiscal strains on cities at the present time is set by a turn to the bond market to finance many of the municipal activities. This describes the municipal debt market from the Second World War till 2011. You can see that the explosive growth in the municipal bond market occurred essentially at the beginning of the neoliberal era. And since Reagan, more or less, the United States has been operating under a system in which local government has to turn to Wall Street to finance major restructuring projects, rather than these being financed through intergovernmental transfers. So the backdrop to the fiscal pressures faced by cities today then is this financialisation of urban budgeting itself, which is one of the most significant structural developments in the system. This chart gives you a sense of what the state governments have done in response to the crisis of 2008. The numbers of states are the 50 US states along the bottom. The principal strategies of states after 2008 have been firstly to implement a series of cuts, direct and sharp reductions in financing brought on immediately after the Wall Street crash. The majority of states have engaged in various forms of radical workforce reorganisation and rationalisation. There's been a new wave of restructuring, including new privatisation programmes, the reorganisation or abolition of various government agencies. And most local and state governments have been experimenting with fee and sin taxes on gambling and so forth. Many can't increase income taxes or property taxes, often by law, but they are allowed to experiment with these charges of fees to try to increase revenues. And so this is a story really of immediate fiscal contraction forced on the states and on the cities by this doctrine of fiscal federalism. So I want to narrate some of these main changes in the remainder of the time that I've got here. What it's produced at the local level is the trickle-down of financial discipline. According to the Pew Charitable Trusts, there's been a 1-2 punch of falling revenues and increased need at the local level, especially again in the large cities. This has been accompanied by historic reductions in fiscal transfers from Washington to the states and from the states to the cities. So the whole system of redistributive financing has been gradually wound back, in fact since Nixon, but now it's in an extended state of deconstruction. So individual cities then find themselves caught between a very low or flat tax base, often with mandates against deficit spending imposed upon them by their states, and a collapse in revenues. Many of them rely on property taxes as a principal source of income. There was a big property crash after 2008, and so revenues increased dramatically and weren't compensated by any other source. So this means that cities have no option but to shrink dramatically and very quickly as financial conditions change. The Government Accountability Office in Washington, D.C. estimates that property tax revenues will not return to their 2009 levels until 2039 in the United States. So this is not a cyclical downturn. This is a structural change in the way in which the state and local government system is managed. According to the Government Accountability Office again, the state and local government fiscal gap has become structural in character, and so with no policy change, there will be expenditure reductions will be required of the order of 12.7% per annum every year to 2062. So this is a multi-decade, long-run process of fiscally driven restructuring and contraction of the state and local government system. which will dominate much of this decade. What it does, in effect, is to lock in a kind of lean local government. It locks in, to a certain extent, neoliberalised patterns of local government delivery based on relatively minimalist government services, where financial stress is a permanent feature of those systems. Workforce rationalisation is the next theme. Since 2008, there's been a dramatic attack on local government workers and on unions in particular in the local government sector. If of the remaining union members in the United States, 50% of them work in the local government sector. It's now the backbone of what remains of the union movement, and this has been under concerted attack since 2008. Already relatively lean, some local governments have been reduced to night watchman status, almost according to Hayek's own vision, where 70% of remaining city employees work in either the fire service or the police service. So you literally have a night watchman state in many smaller cities that really only do emergency services and don't provide any other services to local residents. This graph gives you an impression of the way in which local government employment has been restructured after recessions. Along the bottom is the number of months since the recession started, and you can see the different lines there that indicate the way in which the local government sector has been restructured. The Bush to Obama recession that started in 2007 has seen the longest and deepest reduction in government employment since the Reagan years. The only comparable attack on public sector employment was the early 80s Reagan period. If we extend this line forward, it now is a deeper and longer set of cuts than the Reagan period. This contrasts, for example, with the Nixon-Ford recession of 73 to 75, when there was a Keynesian adjustment during the recession. The Keynesian logic, of course, is that you increase government employment during a recessionary period. The neoliberal logic is you cut employment during a recessionary period, and that has been the dominant pattern since the 1980s. Since 2008, some 600,000 local government workers have been laid off in the United States, and many of them were unionised workers. Restructuring. Many local governments have been forced by fiscal necessity to engage in dramatic forms of restructuring, and fire sales of remaining public assets have been one of the ways in which this has been managed. So in Pontiac, Michigan, the city of Pontiac, for example, an emergency manager was appointed by the state governor that took the place of the elected officials to run the city according to an unmediated financial logic. The first actions of that emergency manager were to reduce the budget by 25% and then put up for auction most of the remaining public assets. So there was a public auction for 2 of the community centres, 5 fire stations, 11 water pumping stations, 10 parking lots, the public library, the police station, and 2 cemeteries. There was nobody bid on any of these assets, and so they remain on the public books essentially as rotten assets that the private sector is not interested in. And this means that looking forward, the public sector becomes the repository of difficult to manage deteriorating assets, promising a yet more problematic financial future as those kind of residual assets are piled up in the public sector. And anything that can be sold or privatised will be sold or privatised. Cities across the country were forced by dint of, again, financial emergency to shut off the street lights because they couldn't afford to pay the electricity bills after 2008. So this happened to cities in Illinois, in Oregon, in Minnesota, in Colorado, and in Washington State, many of which had to turn off the streetlights after 2008. In Highland Park, Michigan, just outside Detroit, the municipality there did a deal with the privatized electricity company to remove 2/3 of the street lamps, to tear them out of the ground and to scrap them, returning the city permanently into darkness because they couldn't afford to pay the costs of street lighting. There have been new waves of privatisation across the country. All kinds of gimmicks have been invented to try to privatise what remains of public assets. There's a new effort to sell naming rights on school buses, on fire hydrants and other locations like that. The Texas prison system has eliminated lunches at weekends for its inmates on the grounds of financial stringency, and has eliminated the last meals for death row inmates according to cost considerations. Riverside County, California, which is just outside Los Angeles, is trying to cope with a flood of 33,000 inmates into its county prison system, dumped on it by the state prison system, and it is trying to respond to that by charging the prison inmates $142 a night to be in prison. It's a cheap hotel rate perhaps, but rather unreasonable, I think, to charge incarcerated individuals to stay in prison. But these kinds of desperate measures might seem almost comical if it weren't for the fact that these are forced on the cities by, again, financial stringency and the lack of reasonable alternatives. So it's in this context then that we can think about Detroit not as an exceptional case produced by a feckless working class or by an ineffectual political leadership of the city, but as an ordinary crisis of this kind of cascading series of crises through a financially restructured system. Now, Detroit is one of the cities that has gone into bankruptcy, and it must be said that municipal bankruptcies are statistically rare events in the United States. The bankruptcy code is designed not for cities but for corporations. It's difficult to liquidate a city. There are still residents there at the end of the process that will need various forms of services. So the bankruptcy code is a very painful last resort for both cities and for creditors. It's only used when there's really no alternative at all. This gives you a sense of the roller coaster pattern of municipal bankruptcies since the early 1980s. Some of the most famous were in Orange County, California in 1994. More recently, Jefferson County, Alabama, San Bernardino, California, and so on. Detroit is one of the cities, the largest ever municipal bankruptcy was the city of Detroit. Has now added to this list. What's striking about this is not necessarily its the increased number, but I think the cyclicality is a metaphor for the way in which government spending has itself become cyclical since the onset of neoliberalisation. So state revenues and government revenues have become increasingly cyclical since the 1980s. So in the last downturn after 2008, state revenues fell immediately by 13%. That's 3 times faster than the rate at which they fell in the 2001 recession. It's 6 times faster than the rate at which they fell in the Reagan recessions. So there's an increasing level of financial discipline introduced in each cyclical downturn, each of which reduces the size of local government yet further. In the state of Michigan, the state in which Detroit is located, a particular response to these fiscal pressures has been to introduce emergency manager arrangements at the local level. These are the cities and city entities which currently have an emergency manager in the state of Michigan. You see a number of public school systems as well as a number of cities themselves now have a manager imposed by the state governor over the elected officials at the local level. I mentioned that the way in which austerity and financial cuts work is that they work unequally socially and tend to impact the poorest and marginalised residents most intensely. Here you can see the share of the population of Michigan that lives under an emergency manager, effectively where local democracy has been suspended and the rule of a financial manager is imposed in the place of local democracy. There are 10 million people living in the state of Michigan. 1 million of those, 1 in 10, live under an emergency manager with effectively no local electoral control. But if you look at the difference between the white and African American population, you can see that only 2.7% of white residents of Michigan live under emergency manager, whereas nearly 52% of black residents of that state live in a city which has an emergency manager. So this is dramatically, racially and socially unequal in its impact. So cities like Detroit then, when they are on the edge or entering financial bankruptcy, essentially are faced with a situation in which restructuring of municipal services becomes an imperative, if not indeed an actual emergency. So the threat of bankruptcy becomes an accelerant. It speeds up urgent forms of restructuring, new programs of privatisation, cutbacks to municipal pay and benefits and that sort of thing, all tend to occur in the shadow of bankruptcy. What the Bankruptcy Code also does is to contain the pain of fiscal restructuring to local jurisdictions. It internalises and intensifies the cost of adjustment, which essentially must be borne by the citizens of the jurisdiction that has entered bankruptcy. It devolves risk socially and spatially and concentrates the pain of adjustment on designated local populations. And within local government, it empowers change managers of various kinds, which can operate increasingly muscular forms of management and techno-fiscal discipline. A new class of fiscal technocrats tends to take lead positions in the management of financially stressed municipal administrations to drive through strict programs of restructuring. And we see new waves of dispossession via privatisation, the residualisation of troubled services and rotten assets. So these are the effects of bankruptcy then in a more systemic way. So when Detroit's emergency manager, Kevin Orr, took control of the city, he took control by stating that I'm not a political animal, I'm a restructuring professional, and I'm going to function in that capacity. He had no experience prior to this of municipal government at all. He was essentially a corporate bankruptcy lawyer, brought in to be this specialist financial manager of the city. Emergency managers like Kevin Orr assume the powers to void municipal contracts, to reorganise the functions of municipal government, to close departments, to downsize and privatise city services. And they do so over the heads of elected officials, including the mayor of the city. In the Detroit case, this caused the city to move quickly towards declaring bankruptcy and going through a court-administered process of restructuring. So when Orr took over the city, he said he was going to impose the rule of reason on Detroit. This is a rule, if you like, of financial reason imposed in this very strict way on the city. He did so in concert with the conservative free market think tank in the state, the Mackinac Centre, whose programme, its own suggestions were that essentially Detroit should restructure itself to go through a painful neoliberal structural adjustment in order to restore financial solvency. So the Mackinac Centre said that Detroit should save itself by fundamentally reforming the city's government and business climate. It should save itself and better serve its residents through a comprehensive programme of privatising city services. It should save itself by repealing the city's income tax, by downsizing the city's bureaucracy, and rolling back the regulatory burden on city businesses. So this is a typical menu of neoliberal restructuring measures, of course, which were imposed with the power of the bankruptcy courts and imposed by the emergency manager at the local level. So how is Detroit changing after it's gone through a period of bankruptcy that lasted for a year or so? It's now about a year on the other side of its bankruptcy. And we can see some of the ways in which its kind of really basic public services have been restructured in the light of this kind of financially driven transformation. So first of all, the streetlights. There were 88,000 streetlights in Detroit prior to the bankruptcy. 50% of them were not working. A bond-funded agency has installed 56,000 new streetlights, and there have been complaints that the new lights don't light the sidewalks, and some neighbourhoods are not lit at all under this new street lighting system. There's been a massive programme of blight removal, as it's called, in Detroit. 7,000 blighted homes have been removed. It's approximately a rate of 100 to 150 houses per week are being demolished and taken out of the city on the back of trucks. The speed at which this has taken place has been slowed by the availability of soil to replace the empty basements of these buildings which have been demolished and dragged and taken out of town. A new improved bus service has been introduced, federally funded, with a few new drivers, which means that the city, for the first time in years, is able to meet a basic schedule of bus services. It's not been able to meet them for some years due to a lack of buses and a lack of drivers. So now there's a very basic bus service operating in Detroit for the first time in many years. The trash collection system has been privatised and essentially restored. City workers, on the other hand, are battling massive mountains of illegal dumping and removing 650 tonnes a week of illegally dumped materials from the city streets. Policing of the city has been marginally improved. At the time of the bankruptcy, if you made a 911 emergency call, it was reckoned that you'd have to wait nearly an hour for the police to show up for a serious offence like a homicide, an assault or a rape. Those response times have been marginally improved by increased funding to the police service. The fire service also has seen its response times fall, but only by 6 seconds, as a number of new fire trucks and fire service workers have been added to the municipal payrolls. So what we have here is the restoration of essentially minimalist public services, which are targeted on some chosen neighbourhoods, or the neighbourhoods are effectively redlined and don't get fire service, police service, trash collection and so on. They're designated to effectively return to wilderness. So let me end by saying something about how I think this kind of financially driven restructuring suggests a different kind of future for cities. I want to suggest that the era of entrepreneurial urbanism, or the first wave, if you like, of neoliberal urbanism, is giving way to a process of deeply financialised urban rule. So the first waves of post-Keynesian restructuring after the 1970s were essentially based on the objective of prioritising entrepreneurialism. This is the programme famously described by David Harvey. I think that's now been eclipsed by permanently lean forms of administration based on high levels of outsourcing and privatisation. And that first wave of entrepreneurial strategies, I think we can see now, is essentially predicated on a Keynesian inheritance in the United States. Entrepreneurialism of the 1980s was predicated on inherited structures. Increasingly, those infrastructures are now needing to be replaced themselves under conditions of advanced neoliberalisation and austerity. So we have a logic of devolved cost containment, localisation of risks, fiscal mercantilism, asset shedding and tax suppression, fiscal gating of suburbs, pro-cyclical budgeting and so on becomes the logic of urban management in this more financialised time. And the logic of the growth machine, it seems to me, is being eclipsed by new debt machine dynamics, especially in cities like Detroit, dominated by new forms of technocratic governance and crisis-prone financial fixes, which are essentially mostly temporary in their nature. Detroit still has a growth machine, but it doesn't dominate the politics of the city in anything like it, the way it once did. This is a city dominated by the considerations of debt and debt management and fiscal restructuring. The competitive insecurity was very much the extra-urban logic of entrepreneurial cities. I think that's being replaced by a logic of bondholder value, where bondholders and financial gatekeepers like credit rating agencies are increasingly determining, shaping the conditions of existence for cities. So let me end with a word on the politics of this situation. What I've described here as austerity urbanism feels in some respects like the end game of fiscal federalism, where you've devolved the cost of restructuring to the local level to the point where they really can't reasonably be managed, especially by poor cities like Detroit. But I think it's important to recognise that austerity itself doesn't necessarily make its own gravediggers. The kinds of political responses to austerity that we've seen have been relatively dispersed, defensive, and limited in scope. So we see in response to austerity a localised politics of protest and resistance to try to defend past social settlements, matched with devolved forms of suffering. This is a very tough political terrain. And it occurs alongside cumulatively incapacitated states. And so this local government system now is enveloped by new and constraining rules of the fiscal game, which really establish conditions of existence for urban policy and politics, which are much more restrictive. So the question then is not only what will mayors like Mayor Duggan in Detroit or Bill de Blasio in New York, the question is not only what will they do, but what can they do under these highly constrained circumstances of fiscal existence. Thank you. I'll stop there.